Oh, hey, excuse me. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on what part of the country you're in. I'm Sheila Gunn Reid, who is powering my way through a cold, and I'm joined by my friend William Diaz and Danny Bulford. And we are hosting the Rebel News Daily live stream. This live stream used to be just hosted at noon Eastern, 10 Mountain, where we would talk about the news of the day. But as it turns out, the only news of the day is what's unfolding inside the Public Order Emergencies Commission in Ottawa, what we're calling the Truckers Commission. First off, before we get too far into what exactly we're doing here, how's it going, guys?
Bro, my flight's going well. How are you doing?
It's good. I think so far it's reflecting pretty favorably on us.
Yeah, very interesting stuff today as well.
Yeah, I probably should have taken a sick day, but no amount of stretchy pants and heated blankets on the couch would take me away from watching Steve Bell get ripped apart by Brendan Miller. I should let everybody know how they at home can get involved in the stream. If you'd like to send us a chat, we'll do our best to read it on the air if time permits. If your paid chat is over $5, and you can do that on Rumble. It's called a Rumble rant. On Odyssey, it's called a hyper chat. And unlike the Trudeau colonized media doing their best to polish the turd of the Emergencies Act, we don't take a dime from Justin Trudeau, and that I think it shows definitely in our reporting. Now, I'll ask you, Danny, that we have you. What you're seeing at the Emergencies Act Commission with the chaos that's evident with the OPS, was that your experience? You know, when you had what they call the PLT, the Police Liaison Team Unit, doing their best to negotiate to move some trucks and truckers being willing to do that, and then the OPS just moving in and undoing all of that, notably when they started seizing fuel and charging people with mischief for delivering fuel at Coventry, I think it was. What was your experience? Did you feel the chaos that we can all see now?
Definitely, yeah. And even for on our end of things, like people who were involved in volunteering with the protest, it was very chaotic because it was very last minute, massive in scale, and very little time to plan and prepare. And then I actually don't recall anyone being charged during the fuel seizure at Coventry. I know a couple of people were arrested, but I think they ended up released without charge, which is kind of what I would expect for people that were arrested for mischief, for obstructing enjoyment of property. That's not something I've ever heard of or ever did in my career, was to charge someone for that degree of mischief. Usually a mischief charge would only result after actual property damage had occurred. Now, but I think typically most of these big, large demonstrations or a big event that would happen in Ottawa where there would be multiple police agencies involved, like I used to be involved in, like a Canada Day, they're like, the planning begins for those a year in advance. And so even my own little sniper part of the plan, when I was still doing that job, we would start like months and months in advance. And so this all happened very, very hastily, right? As the convoy was converging on Ottawa. And actually, I kind of had a chuckle to myself the other day when OPP Superintendent Abrams said that, he was talking about short timelines and mentioned that he was engaged on January 24th. I kind of laughed because I wasn't engaged in the protest until January 26th. So he actually had more time to prepare than I did.
And you guys were still more organized than both the OPP and the OPS.
I honestly think, I don't know if you can give us the credit for being organized. I think it was just how industrious the working class of Canadians are. Like, anytime that there was a problem that we needed, that we were trying to think of a solution to solve, people would just do it. They would just come up with a solution and just get the job done. Like snow removal, they just did it. Garbage collection, they just did it. People just took care of stuff. They just took care of business.
Yeah, well, that's a trucker mentality.
It is.
That's what the truckers do. But there's some things you said earlier. You talked about property damage, talked about actual damage that protester would do, or rioters would do. For instance, we saw BLM protests. We saw buildings burn on fire, windows being broken. I think from the beginning of the commission, we often talk about psychological, so-called alleged damage on the citizens of Ottawa. We also often see that, and just today, Steve Bell talked about how the trucker convoy allegedly traumatized Ottawa citizens living in downtown core. And it seems like, according to his testimony, this is enough for him to want to arrest truckers, to want to make sure we implement the Emergencies Act, that we trample on the civil liberties of the truckers. What'd you make of that?
Well, I think, he's using that same inflammatory language that we've seen from elected officials, right? Where they keep talking about the violence that was committed against the protesters. And during Brendan Miller's cross-examination, he got Steve Bell to admit that no real violence within the threshold of the criminal code definition or the Section 2 of the CSIS Act, which is really the only type of violence that you might be able to articulate the implementation of the Emergencies Act to prevent or to address. So I thought that was key. Like, that was a great job from Brendan Miller. And it validates what my experience was, right? Like, we keep hearing all of these allegations of attacks on citizens and ripping masks off and all of these horrible behaviors from the convoy protesters. That certainly was not my experience. I didn't see it. And I was doing perimeter walks around the city of Ottawa late at night, early morning, all the time. And a lot of the people that were helping me in the volunteer side of things, same thing. We weren't seeing that. We weren't experiencing that. And every time I hear those allegations made, I think to myself, okay, well, where's the evidence of that? Because anyone can make a claim, but if you don't back it up with evidence, then it's just your word against ours, right? And in my experience as a police investigator, you almost always have to have some type of corroborating evidence to go with the allegation that's made. And so far, I've seen a complete lack of evidence to support those claims.
You know what? I think we skipped ahead of ourselves a little bit here, because we really have an expert in the house with us. For people who don't know, Danny, why don't you explain some of your background? Because for you to say these things about the police chaos, you come at this with some expertise.
Yeah, well, okay. So I was a RCMP officer for roughly 15 years. I spent the first 6.5, almost 7 years of my career doing general duty policing up in the Yukon Territory. And then I transferred to Ottawa in 2013, where for the last 8 years of my career, I was a full-time sniper observer on the National Division Emergency Response Team. And so we would do all of the typical things that a tactical unit would be expected to do. Plus, because we were here in Ottawa, in the National Capital Region, one of our primary functions was supporting the protection of the Prime Minister and other VIPs, visiting heads of state. And so I've been involved in a number of these huge events that are often happen in downtown Ottawa. And actually, I've been heavily involved in the planning of those events as well.
I was going to say, you would be involved in the planning and preparation for an Emergencies Act level event. So I guess you would be the expert to say that this actually doesn't rise to any of those things. But you said a lot of really interesting things in your first response to us. One of the things I found interesting was the difference between a left-wing and a right-wing protest. A left-wing protest generally brings carnage, destruction, rapes, and drug overdoses. And in this right-wing protest, in 3 weeks, they built a little bit of a society. They had garbage pickup and street cleanups, and they were feeding the homeless, and they had, like emergency services almost, when people get hurt. But that's when you have useful people converging on a place, and they have useful life skills. But you also noted the lack of evidence for the things that former interim Chief Bell was saying. And I think that's why it's so important that he keeps redefining what violence means. He referred to violence as, the things that people were feeling emotion-wise,
Mhm.
and not actually what they were experiencing physically. Um, there was I tried to quickly write down what he was saying when he was pushed back by Brennan Miller, and he said he was describing the violence that they felt and not the violence that they experienced.
Mhm.
He said it was like the perpetual honking, the interactions they had on the street. So just the fact that there were blue collar people on their street who held different viewpoints, that amounted to violence. And you expect that sort of language from a left wing career student, but not the guy in charge of policing during the time of an alleged national crisis.
Mhm.
Well, on the honking issue in particular, yeah, for sure. The first couple of days there was a lot of honking, but it's certainly like to say it was incessant 24/7, 7 days a week. That's not true. By 4 days in, I think by February 1st, I received my very first complaint from an Ottawa resident about the honking, and even by the time that I spoke to that Ottawa resident, I advised them that the truck captains had already established a honking schedule in respect of the Ottawa citizens, because they didn't want to wear out their welcome. And it was, I think it was roughly, if I remember correctly, it started off once on the hour from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And then I think it got tweaked a little bit from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then there'd be no honking throughout the middle of the night. Now, that's not to say that there may not have been the odd random honk throughout the 3 weeks outside of that scheduled time. However, the vast majority of the convoy participants and the truck drivers with the big horns prescribed to that because we were all on the same page. Everyone knew that the narrative was going to be completely stacked against us to try and demonize us and make us appear to be the worst type of human being possible. And so everything that the convoy protesters did was like a PR move by design, right? We wanted to make sure we appeared completely non-threatening. The message was always peaceful, no matter what. That's why there was the bouncy castles and the attempt to make it look like more of a festive atmosphere as opposed to like an aggressive one. The garbage collection, the snow removal, the veterans who stood on guard to provide security for the war memorial, the convoy protesters who tented out in those temperatures 24/7 to guard the Terry Fox statue. Every single allegation that was thrown at us, the protesters responded with their own solution to that problem, with the desired effect of winning over the hearts and minds of the people who are actually watching it firsthand.
And not only did you manage the honking only a couple of days after it started, but then you also had the injunction.
Yeah, the injunction came afterward.
That started with Zexi Lee saying that you're not allowed to honk anymore. So there was really no honking 24/7, 7 days a week.
That's completely false. Yeah.
Some of the things that Steve Bell used, he said there were hate or bias crimes, but and he also said assaultive behavior and a sense that residents couldn't leave their houses. Well, somebody else's agoraphobia is not really a civil liberties, just like a justification to strip so many people of their civil liberties and seize their bank accounts, because a lot of people are on a little bit too much CBC and have too much anxiety. But the hate and bias crimes, that's actually a thing. And unfortunately, he has no evidence to back that up, because Brennan Miller just absolutely destroyed him when he impugned him with his own crime statistics. The first, and it was interesting because Brendan Miller was playing like 4D chess and I was just reading documents. So he went through the initial amount of actual charges that stuck between January 27th and February 13th. So the day before the invocation of the Emergencies Act, 16 criminal charges stemming from the convoy. At one point, I bet 100,000 people had converged on the city, and 16 charges. That was it. And as it turns out, the majority of those were for mischief, for delivering firewood and the like. But it was funny because Steve Bell said, Oh, but you know what? There's a better document with a better breakdown. So Miller goes, yeah, I got it, and tries to show it to him. And then the OPS lawyer objects, which was
Yeah,
pretty
well,
funny. But
can we show part
sorry,
of
just
the sure.
I just want to go through the breakdown though. So as the breakdown was, the secondary document that OPS said was better, but then they didn't want to show it. There were no hate crimes during the entire convoy. There were no charges of uttering threats to damage property. In total, there were 5 violent offenses charged between January 28th and February 13th. So 4 charges for assault. There were days when no one was charged whatsoever, and just 1 assault with a weapon charge. And as you know, that can be anything. It doesn't have to be a firearm. Go ahead.
I have some information on that, actually, which was
Please.
Spoken about at one of the press conferences that I did with Tom Quiggin during the convoy, where some of those offenses that are related to the protest were actually people who were targeting the protest. So one Ottawa resident who's well known to police, he's a police regular, he was charged with carrying weapons in a public place. So some of those weapons charges
Isn't that
stem
interesting?
from that. But there, and of course, the media wrote about it, but there was no correction made by the police or by the media after the fact when and I had actually shared some of his social media posts with the police liaison saying, hey, look out for this guy, he's talking about like harming people and harming the convoy. And then the assault with a weapon, I don't know for certain, but not too long into the convoy, there was a female counter protester, I guess you could call it, that was walking past people who were preparing food on the side of the street and used OC spray, like pepper spray, on some of the convoy protesters. And the Ottawa Police Service happened to be right there and ended up arresting her and taking her away. And then there was another report of a local Ottawa resident who had smashed the window, I believe at a Shoppers Drug Mart. And I believe it was actually called into the police by one of the truckers. So even though they claim that all these charges are related to the protest, it may be related, but it doesn't mean that offenses were committed by convoy protesters, right?
Yeah,
so
that's interesting.
I think
that's
we're
just
seeing
like
a play on words.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's just like the so-called arson that was attributed to the convoy and then it wasn't all of a sudden, but that lie got all the way around the world before the truth put its pants on. And I might be the only person who actually reads through the evidentiary documents that are submitted to the commission that they refer back to, and you can sort of see them scroll past interesting things. Well, I go back and look at those documents, and as it turns out, that arson was so deadly that it was never actually reported to police until the police saw the social media postings on the internet, because they reported it to Twitter and they didn't actually report it. And so the police went on their own to investigate, wondering why nobody had bothered to report this deadly arson. I guess because it didn't fit the narrative.
Can I also make one more point about the hate crime?
Sure.
You know, that was alluded to by Deputy Chief Bell. However, then his own crime statistics proved that there was no charges laid regarding any of those offenses. However, I am aware that there was a hate crime investigation by the Ottawa Police due to a hate crime that was committed against the Vanier Community Bikers Church during the time that the convoy was in town. Yeah.
Just before you continue, Sheila, because we've been talking for a little while, I think some of the viewers didn't necessarily watch the commission. So would it be possible to show one of the clips from Brendan Miller having the interaction with Steve Bell from this afternoon? Perfect.
Morris, already you sort of touched on that, and he had stated that the lack of violence in Ottawa during the protest was actually shocking.
So I don't recall that statement.
All right. So is it fair to say that when you use the phrase violence, you're not actually describing any form of physical assaults, are you? Well,
physical assaults do contribute to what I'm describing. I was specifically describing the violence that our community felt as a result of the culmination of actions that the occupiers engaged in.
So the violence that they felt, not actual violence, is that what you're saying?
That is correct. Not the criminal code definition of violence, but the violence that they felt by having incessant horns blared.
Right, and
by
not
having trucks run 24/7 a day.
Right.
By having people intimidate them and follow them, and by having people rip masks off their head, by feeling sheltered in their homes.
Well, thank you. I understand what you mean, but you're not talking about violence under Section 2 of the CSIS Act, are you?
No, I'm not.
Thanks.
And he used the same arguments, the masks getting ripped off on the face for protesters.
Okay, that's
the same
actual
arguments that Jim
violence.
Watson did.
Yeah, but that's actual violence. Where's the charge for that? If that actually happened, where are those people to be charged?
And everything else, he just admitted that it has nothing to do with actual violence, according to your own laws. So, I mean, thank you for that, Steve Bell.
Well, I mean, and I think like the vast majority of us who were here would never condone anyone ripping someone else's mask off of their face or any kind of behavior like that. But I've heard that claim over and over again, and I have yet to see any compelling evidence that that actually occurred.
Or even an arrest related to the incident.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There are some other crazy things that he said too, that he's, that he couldn't even, he keeps wanting to try to insist that the Emergencies Act was necessary. He's seems to be the only one who's sort of playing that political side of it. The other one said, yeah, it would have resolved on its own. It was kind of nice to have. It sped things up, but it wasn't necessary. He's trying to play fast and loose, saying, it gave us that firm operational footing to create the exclusion zone, the red zone, as they called it. But from what I understand, they had the tools to do that under existing Ontario law.
Yeah. And so my experience with big events, like let's say the G20 summit that happened in Toronto back in 2010, which did involve like some serious property damage and burning of police cars during the riots. They had a controlled access zone established before that summit occurred, and they usually do before most summits do. And there was, and I don't know why you would require an Emergencies Act to establish a red zone when they establish controlled access zones on a regular basis without invoking an Emergencies Act.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I remember, I think it was the G20, they called it the free speech zone, but you could only have your little free speech in one area.
Yeah.
Laughable. I also noticed that Brenda Lucki, RCMP commissioner, featured prominently in a few things here. For example, there's an email between herself and public safety where she is telling them that she said, that said, I'm of the view that we have not exhausted all available tools that are readily available through the existing legislation. There are instances where charges can be laid under existing authorities for various criminal code offenses occurring right now in the context of the protest. The Ontario Provincial Emergencies Act, just enacted, will also help in providing additional deterrent tools to our existing toolbox. These existing tools are considered in our existing plans and will be used in due course as necessary. That's what she says on February 13th to the Public Safety Ministry. That's pretty damning, because that hangs it around the neck of the RCMP, but also Mendocino. His ministry knew that there was plenty of things they could be doing that they weren't doing, and instead he just went, he hit the nuclear button.
Yeah, and even Deputy Chief Bell did finally, under cross-examination from Brendan Miller, did concede that there was existing legislation or existing tools that they could have used prior to requiring the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, there were other things too, like just if you read these emails back and forth, you guys were willing to move trucks. You were trying to move trucks. You're sort of limited. They don't have enough cops to help you move trucks because the OPP were dealing with Windsor. You can see that in the policing staffing up numbers. Once Windsor resolved, OPP deployed to Ottawa. It had nothing to do with the Emergencies Act. But there were times in here where you could see that you guys were trying to move trucks, but then they said, don't move them there, because the senators will have to walk past them. So, it was just like, like you guys were doing your best, it sounds like, to alleviate the pressure, the violence, if you ask Steve Bell, on the local residents, but the police weren't being accommodated, and they were sort of trying to spare the well-kept senators the ugliness of it all.
Well, and one other thing that Deputy Chief Bell said in his testimony that kind of piqued my ears, but it's consistent with what we've heard from other police witnesses so far, is he kept saying that the Emergencies Act provided this stable framework for what they're to basically execute their plan. But prior to that, earlier in his testimony, he was using that same language, and he said something about to clarify or clearly communicate to our members what authority they were acting under. And so I think there's been a lot of discussion back and forth between the police witnesses prior to Steve Bell about how there was a lot of questioning amongst police, especially for the fuel seizure at Coventry Road, as to what lawful authority they were about to conduct an enforcement action under. And there was definitely some contention and some debate within the police services about their lawful authority to do what they did. And to me, my impression, which seems to have been confirmed by, I think, I can't remember if it was Chief Superintendent Retired Party or Superintendent Abrams from the OPP. I can't remember which one of them said that. It was more like the political masters, or maybe that was Chief Slowly's notes, one of them, but they were more, it seemed like it was probably more of an action that was influenced by, I would say, Ottawa City Hall. I would presume Ottawa City Hall to like show the residents, the angry residents, like a quick win of sorts.
You know what, that came out in the testimony of the hyper anxious city councilors, Matthew Fleury and Catherine McKinney. They said that they wanted to pass bylaws, even though bylaws couldn't, the bylaw officers were told by the police, don't enforce in the red zone. Or if it's convoy related, you don't enforce, we'll come in and do it. So they said they wanted to bring in additional bylaws. They said, give us your top 3 bylaws for us to pass to make it look like we're doing something. Because they were willing to bring in bylaws nobody could enforce just for the perception of usefulness.
For political optics.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I think it was Abrams who said that it was, I forget what I was going to say. He was talking about, I think, the paranoia of Chief Slowly. He seemed really paranoid that people in the ministry wrote to get him. He thought the OPP were acting against him. It just revealed not only the chaos, and the chaos came from the top down all along. I thought maybe Slowly is maybe one of the not truly bad guys. Not to say that he was good, but maybe not that he was great. No, I don't think there are any good guys in here. I keep describing it as that Spider-Man meme where they're all just like dressed the same and pointing at each other. No, you're the bad guy. No, they're literally all the bad guy here. You could see the reiteration of the political narrative when Brenda Lucky, sorry, I'm reading from my phone. She said in a communication with OPS that they need to consider other treading narratives. For example, if this was BLM, would policing be so hands-off? Is this woman crazy? You couldn't get more hands-off than the people dealing with BLM. She said, we think of the protest, politicians think of the impacts on people. And she said that we need to take a more measured approach. But you could tell that she was thinking about the political optics of this, and it sounds like she wanted more enforcement, but not necessarily the Emergencies Act.
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. That was my interpretation of what she was writing, what she had communicated as well.
Sorry, I'm just going through my notes here. Do we have another clip? Sorry, go ahead.
I just saw on that post that you just had up on the screen there about the cops taking a knee.
Yes.
I was doing Overwatch for the ground people, during the BLM protest here in Ottawa, and they were intimidated into taking a knee. They were having people, like huge crowds of people, right? It was a massive crowd of people, were like just yelling at these handful of poorly equipped officers on the ground in front of the American embassy and throwing items at them, specifically like bottles of like water bottles, until I think all but one of them, if I remember correctly, all but one of them took a knee. And basically they were demanded to take a knee in submission. Yeah. And you didn't see that from the convoy protests, that's for sure. I never.
Now I remember what I was going to say. It was the concerns from Abrams about his officers being involved in illegal arrests.
Right.
He called them snatch and grabs.
Yeah.
Which is like narco state stuff. And he said that his OPP officers, this is what Slowly wanted to do. And he said, forget it. No OPP officer is going to be involved in that. And he wanted to grab the high profile protest organizers and influencers. So I guess based on your social media account, maybe, wanted to grab them. And there's some evidence that Brendan Miller alluded to from some people involved in the protest, that they were snatched and grabbed, and he described it as kidnapping because they were not charged. They were pulled out of the protest and driven to the outskirts of town and dropped off in a parking lot at -30 without a building or a phone. Nobody knew where they were. They didn't know where they were dumped there. And that's how people end up dead, if I recall correctly, from an incident in Saskatchewan about 10 years ago.
Yeah, the Saskatoon Police Service.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that Abrams was really concerned that his guys were not going to be involved in, but that was what Slowly and Chief Bell were doing.
Now, I do think most of those arrests happened during the major mobilization where they were dismantling the convoy on the 18th and the 19th. Yeah. But I have spoken directly to people that happened to. They were driven out to an industrial area and dropped off and just had to make their own way back to some degree of shelter or reconnect with people all on their own.
Once again, if you want to help fund our trip here in Ottawa so that we can bring you the other side of the story, because we are some of the only independent media accredited to the inquiry, make sure once again to go to truckercommission.com.